Uh, Good. That's Bert Hadnoda, who is an archivist in the Hoover Institution. And if anybody doesn't know it, the origins of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace are the documents that Herbert Hoover acquired, collected, liberated when he was in charge of famine relief in Europe after World War I. So there's a very long tradition of working on this subject at the Hoover Institution. And Bert, as the archivist for that, would not have the position were he not considered among the best in the business at this. So without further cutting into his time, thank you for being here. Thank to all of you. He'll speak for 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the room and from Zoom land. Bert, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. And I am delighted to be here. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for joining on Zoom land. And I think you can see a slide up there. And this is where we're going to be going in a few minutes. So I'm going to give you an excursion, a little tour of this exhibition, which happens to be about a famine that took place a century ago in Soviet Russia. Okay, and it's also about an American relief mission. And as you can see from the dates, we don't want to go to that slide yet. As you can, we'll stay on that for a while. As you can see from the dates, the exhibition is up, it says through April. I'll actually remind you toward the end, it's actually going to be up into June. But before I go to that, I thought, and Tom had asked me to do this, I would give some general comments about famine. I teach a course, a seminar, that actually is just winding up now. I read a couple of the final papers of the students today. They're okay. And the seminar is called Famine in the Modern World. And actually it's turned out to be quite popular in the last few years. And unfortunately, as famine seems to be resurgent in the world. And, I have to say, that having read, as I did yesterday, the Daniel Maxwell article that was distributed to you to read, and I know you all read every word of the article, right? That's pretty good. That's really well done. He teaches at Tufts and has some good colleagues there who study famine. He gets most of the highlights. There are a couple of things that he kind of misses, which I'll talk about for very briefly, but he's right about famine making a comeback. He's right that after the Ethiopia famine of the 1980s, remember We Are the World? We really thought that famine was becoming extinct, was becoming a thing of the past. And as the Maxwell article says, then came Somalia, 2011. 258,000 people died in that famine. More than half the victims were under the age of 5. So kids get around, are on the front line. Think about this, 258,000 dead. The total population of Somalia back then was 13 million. So pretty sizable. Today it's about 17 million, and another famine is threatening now. A couple of other highlights from the article. Almost all present-day famines result from strife, wars, civil wars, natural factors when they are present at all. So drought or pestilence, they serve as triggers. They don't really cause the famine, they trigger it. And lately, the famines that we're seeing here, South Sudan, Yemen, Somalia again, and Ethiopia. The author is very good about saying that Malthus, that's Robert Malthus, had this idea that famines were caused by too many people, too many mouths to feed. We have blown that away in the last, I would say 20, 30 years. The scholarship has really shown that famine is not about a population explosion. That was a very popular thing to say in the 1960s, 70s. The guy who's led the way in really putting Malthus in his place is actually a colleague of Daniel Maxwell's at Tufts. His name is Alex Duvall, small d-e, capital W-A-A-L. He's mentioned as one of the leading experts in the on famine anywhere. It just so happens that I've been in touch with him today, and it looks like we'll have him, we're hoping to have him come out here in a couple of months to give a presentation in the speaker series associated with the exhibition. He also mentions another person whose name you should know, Stephen Devereux, D-E-V-E-R-E-A-U-X, really the other leading expert with Alex Duvall. And they make the point that there are old famines and new famines. And essentially the new famines begin in the 20th century and are caused by politics. So war, civil war, but also the communist experiments, right? This is one of the reasons we had this major famine here. A couple of other points he makes. He's very, very on the mark in saying that everything changed about the study of famine when Amartya Sen published a book called Poverty and Famine in 1981. It changed the way we think about famine. Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1998 for something completely different, not about famine, but he came up with an analytical model. You're going to have to read the article to get the flavor of it. It's called the entitlement approach, kind of off-putting. He could have chosen a different terminology. But what he says with the entitlement approach is that famine is primarily an issue of inadequate access to food rather than outright food shortages. Now, there can be food shortages as well. That's built into the model, but the model has stood up. It's had to be revised over the years. Alex Duvall, Stephen Devereux, and others have been doing that, but the basic model has really proved to be very durable. Another couple of points, the current situation. Daniel Maxwell's article, he's so right. A steep rise in acute food insecurity in 2022. And this is the result of COVID and those disruptions. And he explains why that's the case, and also the Ukraine war. And he really hadn't gotten a sense when this article came out last fall of the extent of the disruption there. Today, Somalia is on the brink of famine. And it's weird, I say on the brink of famine. It's been on the brink for months, the government hesitating to call it a famine, international authorities hesitating to do it. This one is really related to drought. The Horn of Africa, 5 years running, has had a poor rainy season. That's not going to go away. Two other things. A point that Maxwell makes that I would have actually emphasized a little more. Most people in a famine do not die of starvation. They die of famine-related contagious disease. And this gets amplified by what the author calls distress migration. So refugees on the move, spreading and contracting contagious disease. We'll see some of that in my slides in a moment. But the key thing, and he could have made a bigger deal of this, the academic literature has been very slow to recognize this. That is to say, to recognize that people don't starve to death. Not typically, right? So you still read in some of the great textbooks, and there are some really good books out there, in the Soviet famine of whatever, 6 million people starved to death. No, they did not. By far, most of them died of famine-related disease. There's one big exception, and it's huge. Mao's Great Leap Famine 1959, 62. How many million people died in that famine? 40, 45, you're hearing 35 sometimes. I mean, it's just beyond imagination, right? Most of those people starved to death. That's the way it worked there. There was not a lot of contagious disease. Okay. Now, two things, is he listening, Daniel Maxwell? Two things that I thought were interesting. One, he left out, no doubt on purpose, because it gets complicated. And the other one, he should not have left out. And I don't understand why he did that. The first thing he left out is that Amartya Sen has a second thesis. It's Amartya Sen's twin theses on famine. The second of the Amartya Sen theses, which he introduced in like 1989-90, says that democracies don't get famine. Now that just lit everybody up back in 1989-90. People have been honing that, shaping it, revising it, fine-tuning it. Alex Duvall has done a lot of that, and others as well. And, you know, essentially we realize that these democracies we're talking about have to be mature democracies. So they can't be just elected governments. They have to have civil society in place, a free press and courts, et cetera. And also they can't be beholden to international financial institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF. Devereaux and Duvall make a big deal of this, so-called neoliberalism, right? Getting these governments to shed their safety nets in order to get loans from the World Bank and the IMF. So that's one thing. Sen's other thesis, there's a lot written out there about it. Now, the one that he didn't mention, and maybe I'm wrong about this, in the entire article, somebody will tell me in the Q&A if I'm wrong about this, he did not use the phrase climate change. And my students in the course right now, we're reading Alex Duvall's book called Mass Starvation. I highly recommend it. Terrible title, but I highly recommend it. It came out in 2018. And the students are critical of Duvall for not taking climate change as seriously, even, you know, in 2018, as seriously as he should. But this article, again, unless I missed it, does not mention climate change at all. And if we're talking about famines having become purely political, the result of war, civil war, et cetera, climate change could be a game changer in that regard. And that actually seems likely. Okay, that's my backgrounder. Now, let me just give you a sense of this exhibition, Bread and Medicine. It is a centennial exhibition. There was a famine in Soviet Russia. I'll have a map up in a moment, in 1921. I wrote a book about this famine and about the relief, and we decided to focus the exhibition on the medical relief. And the reasons, it's very clear that the contemporary debates about, you know, COVID, vaccination, masking, and so on, played a huge role. But also the medical relief had been really understudied, under-examined, so we thought we would do that. And again, because most people in a famine don't die of starvation, we wanted to kind of bring that point out. So Scott, we can go to the next slide. So what caused the famine of 1921? A lot of things. You could say the thing was overdetermined, as they say. Destruction, dislocation caused by the World War, the revolution of 1917, especially the brutal Civil War, 1918 to 20, Bolshevik food policy, so communist grain requisitions played a big role, and a drought in 1920-21 was the trigger. This is a Russian Red Cross poster from late summer 1921. It says, "The starving await help. Do your part and get others to help." So late, I would say August of 1921. So the general story, and we can go to the next slide, is that in that summer, the writer Maxim Gorky appealed to the West for help. And it ended, by the way, his appeal with the words, give bread and medicine, which is where we got the title for the exhibition. When the call went out, it was answered by Herbert Hoover in his capacity as chairman of something called the American Relief Administration, ARA. They had been feeding children across Central and East Central Europe, 15 different countries. They had the machinery to do this. They were ready to go in. Negotiations took place in Riga, capital of Latvia, and a deal was signed August 20, 1921. And the ARA is going to go in and deliver an enormous amount of food and medical relief and some other surprises that I'll tell you about in a minute. And, you're looking at this slide. This is what the ARA typically did in its European operations, feeding children in kitchens such as this one. This is in Petrograd, today called St. Petersburg. They opened these kitchens right away in September 1921. So it starts out as a typical ARA operation. The target was 3 million children. That was not typical. I mean, that alone would have been the largest ARA operation ever undertaken. And what happens is they realize we cannot feed the children and let the parents starve, right? It's going to be horrific. So Herbert Hoover asked President Harding to ask Congress for a congressional appropriation, $20 million, to buy corn and send it from the American Midwest to Soviet Russia to feed adults. Okay. So that's in the winter. That's actually December of 1921. Okay. So I'm doing the overview here. Next slide, please. And the central drama of this mission was getting the life-saving corn and seed as well. They spent $10 million on wheat seed, again, from the American Midwest. You must save the harvest of 1922 in order to defeat the famine. Getting the corn and the seed from the ports across the dilapidated railway lines, and then, and it's what you're seeing here, from the railheads to the villages. This is late winter and spring of 1922. They do it. That's, by the way, the frozen Volga River at Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, it was called. Today it's called Volgograd. And yes, those are camels. It's a camel caravan. Enormous obstacles had to be overcome in order to get this thing to work. It was a near thing for a while because of the broken down railway system, the elements, the winter. Even worse was the Russian spring. Right? That can be brutal as well. The obstructions of Soviet officials and also a starving population, simply so worn down, they're unable to help themselves. Plus theft was widespread, etc. But the mission succeeds. And in the summer of 1922, the ARA was feeding a daily meal to 10.5 million citizens of Soviet Russia. And that does include Ukraine. I'll have a map up for you in a moment. So take that, Vladimir Putin, right? So the back of the famine is really broken by the summer of 1922, and the ARA continues a second year with a reduced mission, but an upgrade to the medical program, which is it's sort of beefed up. Okay, let's look at a map. So it's known in the West as the Volga famine. I don't have a pointer, but if you go sort of center right and you see Kazan there, and you go down, you can follow the Volga to Simbirsk, up top, to the right. Nope, right in the middle, Kazan, there you go. And then follow it down to Simbirsk, and then Samara, Samara. There you go, just follow the river down to Saratov. And then Tsaritsyn, that's where the camels are. And then the Volga takes a hard left. We won't need to do that. But that's the idea, is that when the Americans are going to go in, they have the notion that it's just basically the Volga. Once they get there, they realize that it's not simply the Volga. It's farther east. So Ufa in the Ural Mountains, you can see that there, Orenburg, and way far east, and southern Ukraine. You see where Odessa is there, and Mariupol. We've read about those places recently, right? All of those areas in the south are badly hit with famine. But in fact, as the Americans discover, medical famine, that is to say, the shortage of every kind of medicine and medical equipment, exists throughout what we used to call European Russia. So eventually, ARA operations spread throughout this region. There's a food package program that goes on in all of the sort of yellow colored spaces there. Medical relief is going on. And in the green spaces below Moscow and then up toward Petrograd, the ARA operates so-called sanitary trains. They go out on trains and they bring medicines to hospitals and perform other miracles. In total, people are always surprised to hear this. There were at most any one time 200 Americans in Soviet Russia. They were really administrators. So they had a very large staff, over 100,000 local citizens. 30 American doctors served with the medical division. So collaboration was vital to the success of the mission. And if you look at the map to the west, the real concern when it came to medical stuff, you see where Minsk is in white Russia, that's Belarus today, right? And then you see Kiev straight down from there. People are trying by the millions, are trying to leave. And they're going through those places, and their ARA and the Western authorities are very concerned that they're going to bring disease with them. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So let's just get a graphic illustration of the problem. And it's this Soviet poster from 1921. Yeah, 1921, refugees spreading disease. The caption reads, "Stop this flow of the starving by means of your comradely aid." Let's have a look at a photo showing what the Americans encounter in the late summer of 1921. Many scenes such as this. I mean, the Americans can't believe what they're discovering here. Kazan, Simbirsk, Samara, lots and lots of this. And let's go to the next one. The worst of what they witness, and I'm going lightly on the horror stuff here. There's only one other photograph that's a little bit disturbing. They find millions of orphans already, and many end up in these so-called children's homes. There's little, as you can see, in the way of food, blankets, places to sleep. And it's also a place where disease is spread. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted you to see this photo. I mean, there are in the ARA papers thousands of photos. We have quite a few of them digitized. I wanted you to see this. You can see from the caption written on the front that this was in Samara. And you notice the swollen bellies. This is the hunger edema you see in a time of famine. It's actually, they were eating food substitutes, clay, twigs, leaves, bark, ground up bones, worse than that. But it really is caused by a lack of protein in the blood. And so the swollen limbs, swollen stomachs, really, really bad. We have actually in the exhibition, the Hoover Tower, an example of the food substitutes that the Americans brought back a bunch of those. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. What are the priorities of the medical division of the ARA? Probably don't need that translated, right? So this is a poster actually from 1920, before the Americans get there, because typhus, and this is what the poster represents, that's the louse there. Typhus was epidemic in a series of waves, and the next one was about to hit 1920 in the winter of 1921-22. Great concern about this. It's spread by infected lice, and actually it's very interesting. So in 1920, the Red Army had won the Civil War. And actually at the top, it says the Red Army crushed the White Guard parasites, and it names the generals. Then it says a new disaster looms over it, the typhus louse comrades, fight the infection, destroy the louse, right? And there's a poster that we found at Hoover, and it's a quote from Lenin, the text poster. And it says, either socialism will defeat the louse or the louse will defeat socialism. I love that. Very interesting. When the relief workers get out to all of those cities to the east and south, they immediately send appeals to Moscow headquarters. That's where the ARA is headquartered. They want medicines. They want blankets. They want food, of course. Especially, though, they want soap. Soap, soap, soap. That was one of the big surprises for me. There is no vaccine against typhus. So they need hygiene. The words hygiene, sanitation become very important. A total of 8 Americans would contract typhus during the course of the mission. There were 3 or 4 very close calls. One died in Ufa, that city you saw out to the far east. He died in May of 1922. Okay. So and the ARA did okay with typhus. But the real threat, oh no, we go to the next poster. Yeah, the real threat, the one they thought they could make a big difference with, was cholera. And this poster actually is from 1922. I don't know how you can see that, and you people in Zoom land, whether you can, but there are flies everywhere in that poster, including in the water the man is about to drink. And it's, by the way, that man drinking the water. A middle school student pointed this out to me in the exhibition gallery. It's that man who is lying in the hospital bed at the bottom part of the poster there. You can tell by the beard, right? So essentially what this poster is saying is, don't eat raw vegetables and things at the market. Don't drink untreated water. Be very careful. Now here the ARA could introduce, and it did, a massive vaccination campaign. The vaccines were brought in from Paris, from the Pasteur Institute. Some were made locally, eventually, with ARA assistance. There was a tetra vaccine that the ARA ordered. So for cholera, typhoid, and paratyphoid A and B, and there was a separate shot for smallpox. The tricky thing about the tetra one is that you need, and all, by the way, are waterborne diseases that the tetra is aimed at. You need 2 doses of it. And of course, somebody has a bad reaction to dose number 1, is not looking forward to a dose number 2. But this is for the ARA, a huge success. As you can imagine, there was quite a bit of vaccine hesitancy. But we have ways of overcoming that. If we can go to our next slide, please. So you saw on the map Minsk and Kiev out to the west. Minsk in particular, they're very, very worried about the spread of disease by refugees to the west. So they set up a very large refugee camp with a clinic. And here we have a photo, I love this photo, taken inside. And you can see the sign above the man's head at the right there says, cholera threatens, don't drink raw or untreated water. Other posters in the room tell people to wash their hands before eating, visit the bathhouse, and straight through into the back there. And I mean, literally into the back, you see this man being vaccinated. You see that there, right? And we have a lot of vaccine imagery, a lot of vaccine photos. If you're a refugee and you want to leave the country or even purchase a train ticket, you needed proof of vaccination. And it had to be, if you're going to leave the country, the American vaccination. Also, very big deal, the Americans established banyas, bathhouses. You go, you get, your clothes gets disinfected while you bathe. They give you a bar of soap. They imported lots and lots of soap in order to make this happen. Okay, and then next slide. This is the boy and the scene that's on the postcard for the exhibition. We nicknamed this guy Brave Boy, certainly braver than I would have been at that age. And these needles, I mean, we have some video, some film of this stuff, and boy, you had to be brave, or you had to, just steel yourself. And I love the look on the boy's face. So this is actually an ARA kitchen in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg. And these kids are going to get their meal. This is the ultimate leverage that the Americans had. You want your meal, you get your shot. If you're an adult, you want your corn ration, you get your shot, right? So there's a lot of this kind of thing. And you hear, the doctors would say, well, they said, no way we're getting this vaccine, this, mark of the devil. And some of them said, it will put ARA on our arm, And then they said, okay, that's fine, but you're not going to get your corn ration. Whoa. And then they turned on a dime and they wanted their shot. Okay, next photo. Yeah, so I like this photo because it shows we're in Samara again, as you see from the side of the truck. And Dr. Frederick Foucault, you'll see him in a minute. He was the man running the show in the medical show in Samara. And he put a label on this photo saying that it was the Tetra vaccine being shipped from the medical warehouse in Samara out into the provinces. And he says the large cases each contained 1,210 cc ampoules of the Tetra vaccine. The smaller cases contained tincture of iodine, soap, gauze, syringes, needles, etc. Note the writing. Can you see it there? You all sitting at home on some of the crates to the right. Institut Pasteur Paris, right? So this is the Pasteur Institute, Institut Pasteur de Paris. So it's the real deal. Not opened in Moscow, just transshipped. Okay, let's go, since we really have to go to Ukraine. Let's go to Kiev. This is the ambulatory and inoculation point. The sign up there says Amerikanskaya Administratsiya Pomoshi, and that's the American Relief Administration. This is Kiev. It's May 1922. The man right in front of the door there, he's got a coat over his arm, he's got a hat on, he's got a jacket and tie, is the American doctor, Theodore Foster. Next slide, please. So it's even bigger than what I've been showing you. The ARA establishes pharmacies in all the major cities and towns, such as this one in Saratov on the Volga. And they brought in absolutely essential medicines, quinine, cod liver oil, which compensated for the lack of fat in the diet. Quinine, very important because it treats malaria. Malaria was epidemic at the time. A single bottle of quinine, small one, was worth 3 months' pay for an average laborer. This is a very big deal. They had no medicines. That's medical famine. So statistics make me kind of just, do this. So I won't do a lot of that, but get this. I mean, I could go on with this, but the ARA brought in 40 tons of chloroform, 57 tons of castor oil, 15 tons of aspirin, 1,300 sets of surgical instruments, 8 million bandages, and on and on and on. And we can go to the next slide. I like the modesty of this photograph. Surgical hospital in Yekaterinburg. This is in the Ural Mountains. So the ARA brings in the surgical dressings and bandages, which are basically non-existent, disinfectants, hospital clothing. When the ARA arrived, doctors went into the surgical wards and they could see that newspaper was being used to close wounds. People were told to bring their own bandages. I mean, it was just horrific stuff. And the next photo, please. We are now in Kazan. That's the northernmost part of the Volga that we had looked at earlier. This is a hospital where the ARA was helping to treat deficiency diseases. This man in the bed has scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, skin lesions, bleeding of the gums, and so on. There was a lot of serious stuff. He's a 25-year-old worker and ended up in this ward here, run by the ARA. Now, here's the deal. This hospital, like all ARA hospitals, the patients and the staff were fed. So it wasn't just about bringing in medicine. they realized that unless they fed in the hospital, the people would be kept alive and literally starved to death. So if you look at the very center of the photo, the very center, that round object, what is that? It's a white roll. Can we go to the next slide and we'll get a closer look? Whoa, look at that. And it sits atop a container of what is likely corn grits. And if it's not corn grits, it's some sort of, mush, oatmeal, not oatmeal, but mush or something like that. Yes?
I'm gonna ask, where's the fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, no. It's so funny. The question is, where's the fruits and vegetables? And at one time I was, there's going to be a book that goes with the exhibition, and the editor came back to me, and because I had written in there, the children were fed balanced meals. And she said, whose idea of balanced meals is this, right? At the time, it was just about fats and, getting people's calories to burn off. And so they did that kind of thing. Now, if you go back to, can we go back to the other photo there? Since we're having too much fun, look at the guy. The guy at the far right. This is like a photo op. So it's lunchtime, and you see he has one. Look to the right of his head, and he's like, "When do we eat?" Right? So bread and medicine. And if we go to almost done to the next slide. No, did we skip? That's it. So we are in a hospital in Petrograd. Today, St. Petersburg. It's the Obukhovskaya Hospital, founded in 1779. And this is the ARA kitchen scene here. Look at those white rolls. Pretty amazing. And actually, if you look up on the wall, on the shelves to the right, you see the tinned milk, the canned milk. Very popular with the beneficiaries there. They couldn't believe this. There's milk in a can, and you can see Danish Pride. It's very popular. Libby's and Honor. You can actually make that out. Okay, a couple more. Love that photo. And there's Dr. Fukar. He's leaving in June 1923, and he's being celebrated. He's a pretty difficult guy, I think, but he was a brilliant physician. And what you don't know until you're thrown into this kind of thing, he proved to be a very effective administrator. I'm not sure how you could guess this, right? That you could be both, but he was great. And look at him. He's very lucky. He avoided what most of the Americans got before they left, which was the blanket toss. I don't think anyone dared to touch him, do the blanket thing. You see the ARA up there. So the Russian R looks like a P. So that's ARA in Russian. That's the ARA office. Okay, and then two more. Let's go to a poster. Yeah. So the ARA had a poster contest. They ran a poster contest in January 1922 in Moscow because the head of the mission was getting really tired of the rumors going around, spread by the Soviet government, that the aid had to be paid for or that it was provided by the American proletariat. What's that? And all of that stuff. So he got some Moscow artists to submit poster designs. This was one of two winners. Actually, seems like it was the runner-up, but it's very effective. It's stark, and that's obviously Colombia serving, sort of corn to these kids in a village. And you see how this poster pops. If you go to the final slide, might not be the final one. Yeah, so we'll go to there we go. So yeah, you see the poster on the back wall? These posters were printed in tens of thousands of copies. They were put in kitchens and offices, on the sides of trains. They were often torn down in that latter capacity. This is another children's hospital. I haven't determined where yet. I'm on the hunt for that. But the poster in the background really looks like an icon. I know we overuse this word these days, iconic. But here I'm thinking literally of a Russian icon. And then the final one, I'll just show you, and we can leave this up maybe for Q&A or whatever you want to do. But this was a runner-up in the poster contest. And we liked this one so much that it actually ended up in the exhibition at Hoover, and it will be in the companion volume. It's not as red, white, and blue as the others, but it seems it's charming. And there the R is an English R. You see the American flag. It was not allowed for the Americans to fly the Stars and Stripes when in Soviet Russia. This was kind of a way, I wish I brought the other poster, the ship poster. It looks like an American flag. And I think this is a way to kind of smuggle in the American flag. And that's one of the reasons that the authorities found it so objectionable and they would tear them down from the trains. So one aspect of this, final comment, is in a different talk, I could bring this out, but there was a lot of conflict with the Soviet authorities. Initially, Lenin was the leader at that time. And initially, there was a real fear that Hoover was going to try something. He didn't go, but Hoover's men were going to try something. They were going to do some kind of behind the back pass or, boom, 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 the kind of thing. And suddenly the white forces that hate us will have all the food, this kind of thing. They were paranoid. And you can see it. Lenin is just absolutely out of his mind. And he's a sick man in 1921, 22 already. But then they realized, what? These American relief workers are really doing what they said. Non-sectarian relief. They're blind to politics. But that was not something that they could relax about, because you have this organization hiring, by the way, its own people who tend to be anti-Bolshevik types, the people who speak foreign languages, who've worked in an office, who are not going to be very Bolshevik, right? But just the example of efficient humanitarian intervention by the ultra-capitalist anti-Bolshevik Herbert Hoover, it's not a good look, as we would say today, right? So the Soviet authorities throughout the 2-year mission tried to get the credit for the Soviet government. And so spread rumors. In the spring of 1922, they started seizing treasures from the churches, the Russian Orthodox churches. And they were going to do this anyway. But they also decided as a bonus to say to people, we have to take these. The Americans are demanding payment for the food you're getting. Wasn't true at all, of course. Infuriated some of the Americans who heard these rumors, right? Okay, I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Is that what I look like?
That's great. And I'll just start with questions. My mic being picked up adequately.
Not really. You should stand over there.
I'll try this. It was terrific. I'd like to request some elaboration about how did this happen? The 1920, 21, this is beginning, there's still American troops on Soviet soil, having been there to support the white side in the revolution. You mentioned the opposition of Lenin and the Bolsheviks to it, but how did an operation of this magnitude be undertaken?
Yeah, so that's a good one. So go.
Unless two others, because I think the answer will
Sure.
come together. One is the magnitude. You mentioned the tens of millions of dollars.
Sure.
That current dollars then or constant dollars? I think it's probably current dollars, in which case, in today's terms, it's a lot more money.
Yeah.
And it happened just as we're moving into the Red Scare period in American politics. How were the arguments passed? I assume it's humanitarian grounds, that even communist kids, or was it, we will ingratiate ourselves to the people of the Soviet Union and they'll turn on? How was it argued?
Okay, these are great. So by 1920,
Excuse me, could you repeat the commentary and or questions for the Zoom audience? It was hard, Tom, it was hard to hear you. You need to get closer to the speaker microphone.
I can repeat your question and the answer.
Please do.
Repeat the
Yeah, I'll
question.
do it. Yeah. Okay. Let me do that. So Tom had a 3-part question. I love those. And part 1 was a question about, how is this happening? We have American troops that are in Siberia that are basically, joined up with anti-Bolshevik forces. And so how can it be that American humanitarians, American philanthropy goes in there in 1921? A couple of things. We could spend a whole hour on American intervention. The American intervention in Siberia, which really lasted way longer than Woodrow Wilson had anticipated when he first authorized sending the troops in, is really about Japan and making sure the Japanese don't grab the Russian Far East. There are very few clashes of Americans and Bolsheviks and very little coordination with the white forces. It's a bad scene. It's a bonus for Bolshevik propaganda, capitalist encirclement, and all of that. It has very little influence on the outcome of the Civil War. But the fact is they were gone by September of 1920. On the other hand, looking to the West in Western Europe, Herbert Hoover and his ARA had actually tried to maneuver their way in to Soviet Russia in 1919. And there was a negotiation that went on. It was just not going to happen then. The Civil War was at its height. There's no way that Lenin was going to let relief workers in. The starving that was taking place at that time, the famine that was taking place, was in the cities, in the center. Later in 1921, that's a famine that hits the grain growers. So 6 million people will die in the famine, 1921-22. So Lenin is aware of Hoover's might, of Hoover's clout, and that he's trying to get in. By 1921, they really, once the offer came from Hoover, they really felt they had no choice but to accept it. And there's a great telegram from Litvinov, Maxim Litvinov, who negotiated with the ARA in Riga for the Soviet government. And he's about to sign the deal. And he sends a telegram to Lenin saying, the ARA, I firmly believe, comes to us without any ulterior motives, but they will cause us a lot of trouble. Just the fact that they were coming in, they knew was going to be a real problem there. And the Red Scare, actually the Red Scare is dying down by then as well. So the Red Scare is 1919, 1920. That's when it's really bad. And they deport people forcibly to, Soviet Union, back to Soviet Russia. Soviet Union doesn't really begin until December 1922. We call it Soviet Russia. All of that had died down by the time of the call for help from Maxim Gorky, right? But I would say this, that Herbert Hoover was probably the only man on the planet, the only American, certainly, not only who could sort of organize this massive relief campaign. I'll get to the totals in a minute. But also, just as Richard Nixon was the only American president who could get away with going to China in 1972, right? Who had unimpeachable, if I may use that word, anti-communist credentials, right? No one would have thought that Richard Nixon was going to go there and be duped by the communists, brainwashed, to quote one of the Romneys, right? You may remember that. Same applied to Herbert Hoover in 1921. They trusted him. That does not mean that there were not a lot of Americans saying, what are we doing? We're going to bail out Lenin's government. They may well have ended up doing that in the end, inadvertently. But Hoover dealt with all these letters from people saying, why are we bailing the Bolsheviks out? Why are we giving soup to nuts, as one phrase had it, right? I mean, this is ridiculous. Let them go down. And Hoover's answer was, there are children who are innocent He said this about Germany in 1918 and 1919. These people are suffering. We have a duty to go in there and make this happen. And one other thing about that, Hoover had been head of the U.S. Food Administration. Woodrow Wilson brought him to Washington in 1917 when the U.S. entered the war, and he became the head of this new organization, only lasted a couple of years, that would basically galvanize America's food for the U.S. war effort, but also for the Allies' war effort. So Hoover already now begins to plan what we're going to save and grow and ship over for the war effort. The war ended about a year earlier than they thought it would. We forget this now. And we had huge surpluses that were really causing havoc with the US economy. And Hoover, of course, was on the hook for this. This was a way, the aid to Russia, especially the corn, the congressional monies, the 20 million, was a way to do, as Hoover said outright, it's an act of self-interest and an act of humanitarianism. Let's do this, right? We can do this. And, you know, some senators were skeptical and he said, we got to do this. And they did. One other thing is that Hoover had this machinery set up. They had relief workers who had experience with this in Warsaw and in Vienna and in Budapest and in Prague and so on. And they, the veterans, were the ones who went in and, you know, led the way. And so they had experience, they had the machinery, no one else had this ready to go. And I will say that when those Americans got there, especially the first ones to the Volga who saw those scenes I showed you, the railway stations and the kids with the bloated stomachs and everything, they said, never saw anything like this in Central Europe. This is horrific. What they were seeing was a massive famine, mass starvation. They had not seen that in Europe. Ultimately, the first of your questions, but had to do with, you know, we talked about $20 million and how much is that worth today? Ultimately, the total cost of the mission, so the monies that the ARA distributed, and it's the 20 million from the US Congress, it's 10 million spent by the Soviet government on wheat seed. Hoover insisted they do this, a kind of, we'll give you two, you give us one. So a little arm twisting there. And then affiliated organizations with the ARA, the Mennonites, the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Quakers, right? The Lutherans, they had a lot of these organizations chipping in. All those monies taken together came in the end to $60 million, which is hundreds of millions of dollars. I find it really dicey to do the calculator thing, because to me, it's not just the dollar totals. It's the you know, we talk about logistics. Do we really understand what that term means? But it's the logistical challenge, moving this stuff from the Midwest to the ports on the East Coast, and then Baltic Sea, Black Sea, and then the railway lines, and they got this stuff there. It's, to me, that's the thing. And it's, the money is huge. And today we would say probably nearly $1 billion for this, but it's dealing with obstacles we could never imagine today in a much smaller world. So that was,
one more, and let's let you repeat.
okay.
Have we even approximated the magnitude of this effort in the 100-year since?
Have we, the question is, have we even approximated the magnitude of this effort in the years since? And it's an easy answer, no. And it's funny, the Americans themselves, and I quote them at the end of my book, saying there's never going to be anything like this again. They, by the way, the American relief workers as individuals had difficulty coming back to earth, coming back home. They were czars in their own kingdoms. They were saving millions of lives. You saw Dr. Fukar, that's the, you know, modest send-off. I mean, they were kings. They were idols. And then they come back and they've got to fit in. Nobody wants to hear their tales of conquest. beyond, a few days. And so there's that kind of, and then we should say, within a few years, Herbert Hoover becomes president, the Great Depression. No one wants to talk about Herbert Hoover, great humanitarian. The mission is really forgotten. In the Soviet Union, it's, censored, it's blocked out. And so these guys are walking around. Some of them have important jobs, not all of them, but they can't get you to believe that they were saving a nation, as they said, back in the day, back in 1921, 22. I could just say a review of my book that appeared in, I think it was the New York Review of Books. This back 20 years ago now. The title of the review was The Greatest Humanitarian Intervention of Them All. And I don't think anything's topped it since then, right? I mean, it was a massive undertaking. And maybe it bailed out the Bolsheviks, we could speculate about that. So, okay. Oh, there you are.
You want to take the question yourself?
Oh, sure.
And we'll get the Zoom back.
Sure. We have one in the room right here before we go to Zoomland. Don't go
We
away.
can go to-
No, go right ahead.
You can repeat it after.
Sure.
All right, so first of all, thank you for a very uplifting discussion on a very downbeat topic. I really was grateful to see that this really very unpleasant subject brings light and hope to it. But I want to change the tenor, because my understanding is a lot of families going back to the Irish family in the 1840s. There was enough food, but the authorities confiscated food from the farmers, leaving the farmers to starve. And I've heard similar things happen in Ukraine about 10 years after this intervention, 1922, 23. Now it's 32, 33.
That's right.
Is my impression correct? And we're going to comment about that.
Okay, so the question, very good. The question is about whether the Irish, what we call the Irish potato famine, right, 1840s, is really about, there was sufficient food, but that the government basically confiscated food and people starved. And we'll go to Ukraine in a moment because that was part two. Actually, the root cause of that famine was a crop failure. It was one kind of potato that the Irish relied on, and the crop was hit by a fungus. So how the government in London then behaved and dealt with the crisis, you could have a lot of criticism of that, but it's not caused by government action. The best book on that is Black 47, I'm almost certain, and it's a guy named Irishman named Cormac O'Grada. And he's also written the best textbook called Famine, A Short History. You can get that on Amazon. And I think his Black 47, that's his best book. And it deals with that. No doubt it's the over-reliance on and I'm not thinking is it the lump of potato? I'm not remembering. And that crop fails and that sets things in motion. But certainly the ramifications of that are made worse by all kinds of socioeconomic factors that were influenced by the government in London. On Ukraine, because it comes up a lot. So the question is, the government role in the famine that happened in Ukraine, 1932-33. There's famine beyond Ukraine, 1932-33. But that one, the Holodomor, is what Ukrainians call it. It's like a sacred term. It means death by famine or killing by starvation. And in that case, what happened is Stalin had moved to collectivize agriculture. So collective farms, the end of private farming. And the strongest resistance came from Ukrainian peasants, Ukrainian farmers. And there was, in fact, a drought, and there was, in fact, a legitimate famine. But then when Stalin still had trouble collecting the amount of grain from Ukraine that he thought the central government should get. They stepped on the gas. And they basically, there's like two phases. And then they went in and they started taking grain from starving peasants, and they, literally cutting off their supply and killing them, deporting a lot of peasants into the east to Kazakhstan. So in this case, it begins as a famine that is caused by dislocation having to do with collectivization and drought, et cetera. But then, particularly on Ukraine, Stalin says they must be taught a lesson, and the results are devastating. Funny thing, in the earlier famine, when the Americans get there, they don't think they're going to go to Ukraine. Well, because it's the Volga famine, right? So then they start to get word from the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that, in fact, the food package program that the Americans set up, it's a food remittance program. So you can put $10 down in the US or anywhere, and the ARA will deliver a package to your loved ones, 117 pounds, flour, rice, canned milk, et cetera. So they get the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, says, look, most of the orders we're getting are in Ukraine. So the Americans say, we need to go inspect Ukraine. And the Soviet government in Moscow says, no, don't need to. There was nothing in the press about famine conditions in Ukraine. And in fact, initially, Odessa turned out to be a very important port for the entry of the American corn and seed and so on. And initially, the Soviet government said, no way you can go through Odessa. You're going to have to find another way to go. So the Americans basically forced the issue and said, the agreement we signed at Riga says we can go anywhere, any of these republics. So eventually they relented. But then when they got there, and the capital was a place called Kharkov. Today it's called Kharkiv. It's been in the headlines. You've probably read about it. And when they get there, the local officials say, we're an independent country. We are Ukraine. You'll have to sign a separate agreement with us. And the Americans are like, you got to be kidding me. People are starving. We need to get to work. And you're part of Soviet Russia. No, we are a confederated state, and you'll have to sign a separate agreement with us. And they do. The Americans have a second agreement, a separate agreement, January 6th, 1922. And then they investigate, and then they realize that there is a massive famine in the south along the Black Sea coast, Odessa being sort of ground zero, and massive operations with the JDC and ARA throughout Ukraine, as you saw on the map. Let's go to Zoom land for a question. Oh, here we go.
Yes. So the first question is, what about North Korea? Are people starving, or are they dying of diseases related to famine?
Okay. So North Korea today, I don't think has, there's a lot of news to keep up with lately, but I haven't heard anything about famishing people in North Korea today. There was a moment, and it was 1995, when reports came out that many, many thousands of people were in fact starving in North Korea. And I remember this because I was working on my book. And here we have like an ideologically hostile regime, and its people are starving. And can we do a kind of Herbert Hoover thing? And I'm supposed to know the answer to this, right? Freshly minted PhD. And I'm just like, I had no idea what to say. The situations are very different, right? And that's a moment. It's actually in the Daniel Maxwell article. Initially, we thought 1 million people had died in that famine. But what had happened with North Korea is that they had lost their source of supply. The Soviet Union had broken up in 1991. That was a major part of the story. Ultimately, we think that the number that of people that died is in a lower range, is still pretty substantial, like 300,000. It's a very secret society, as you know, so we don't have hard figures. But the initial estimates of like 1 million people dying, and maybe that will spell the end of the North Korean government, that did not pan out. But today, if that's the sense of the question, I don't think that, I mean, there's malnutrition, the studies of the stunted growth of the North Korean soldier versus the South Korean soldier, all of this, I mean, you just can't, it's just unbelievable. But famine, starvation, not right now, but who knows? Stay tuned.
Okay, the next question. You said that population growth is no longer considered to be a cause of famine. But what about the effect of population growth on climate change and that in turn on famine? Our economic systems require population growth for corporations to continue to increase profits. Is it no longer considered politically correct to even consider population growth as part of the problem?
Yeah, that's very good. So let me just start by saying that one of the real virtues of the book I mentioned earlier by Alex Duvall, called Mass Starvation, is he goes right at Robert Malthus. He did so in an earlier book, and basically saying population growth has, nothing to do with this, and Malthus was mistaken. He then, in the 2018 book, Mass Starvation, Alex Duvall, had the benefit of having read a very good biography of Malthus, which actually showed Malthus to be a more flexible thinker about famine, that he actually revised his writing when he realized he may have been wrong about how famine actually is sort of God's way of controlling population overgrowth, right? So Alex Duvall makes a big deal about in his book about how modern famines are not related to population growth. It just doesn't work. And his specialty is sub-Saharan Africa. I should say Africa generally. He does a lot on the Horn of Africa as well. So, but this is the problem. My students are very keen on the climate change stuff and how that factors in. And yeah, it came up in our discussion of Alex Duvall's book that maybe Malthus will have his day. There's an economist, Paul Krugman, maybe you sometimes pay attention, he writes a column for the New York Times. And he's a big Malthus person and thinks maybe Malthus's ideas are, sort of coming back around. And it's the intermingling, or how to put it, it's the mashup of climate change and population growth that maybe should cause us to rethink the extent to which population growth influences famine. So yeah, so this is very good. Are you taking my course, by the way? I think no. Okay, but this is actually very relevant to the topic.
And a question here about the ARA. This is very, very fascinating. Where can we go to learn more about the ARA? Take a course, for example, or read some books. What do you suggest?
Okay, so glad you asked. You can go on Amazon and get my book. It's called, it's called The Big Show in Bolo Land. Bolo Land being the land of the Bolos, the land of the Bolsheviks, right? PBS, maybe you know the series American Experience. If you have a passport, I think you can get it, or you just, it's rentable. You can Netflix it. American Experience made a documentary in 2011 based on my book. It's called The Great Famine. And that's a great primer. I still think that's really well done. I'm not into the what do they call those when you get actors and you do the no, but it's what do we call that? Recreation. What is that?
infomercial?
No, it's, they do historical recreations of things. It's, there's a word for it.
Dramatization.
Yeah, sort of dramatization of things. They do, this is the style. So maybe a little too much of that. So, so some other things. We have the exhibition. It's up. It's in Hoover Tower. It's in the gallery. It's the physical exhibition. I can send you through Tom the online exhibition, which is pretty outstanding. I've had students, Stanford students, my students in my course and outside the course, working in the archives on their own projects. 4 of them now have articles published online in the online exhibition, Bread and Medicine. I've got some stuff in there as well. The photos, there are hundreds of photos up in there. There's all kinds, it's just sort of endless stuff. That would be I would say, start with that, and I'll send that link to Tom. There will be a book, Bread and Medicine, that will be out in June, and that is a coffee table book that will deal with a lot of this stuff. There was a film, The Russians, that was made in Russia. This is actually something you should know probably. So I was told that there would be this film called Golod, Famine, and Russians were making it. I was not part of it, not interviewed for it, but they had a bunch of experts and all of that, and so they were going to do this film, and it's an hour and I think 20 minutes, and they were getting ready to show it last summer, and the Ministry of Culture forbade it, took away the certificate. So, basically don't want that kind of thing out there. So they had a couple of screenings. They had a screening of the New York Film Festival last Sunday, and I spoke at that via Zoom. There's a lot of interest in that. It's in Russian, but there's either captions. There must be captions in English as well. They do for that. So basically, it's there are books published in Russia about this, but try to get on TV in Russia. It's like a lot of things having to do with Russia. The state really controls TV, and they're not going to let this have a theatrical release. So, since the war in Ukraine has begun, I think that tide has really turned against. For years, we've been trying to get the American Experience film shown over there. Just not happening, right? It's not going to happen. So I'll send Tom. A good place to start would be that online exhibition. Yes, question here.
You mentioned that areas like you said, Somalia and Yemen and
South Sudan.
yes, South Sudan and Ethiopia are the places where there's the most famine now. And I was wondering what's being done on the national level and also with maybe various groups in the United States. For example, I understand that there were about 3,000 return Peace Corps volunteers left in the Ukraine at the time the Russians came in. And many of them fled, and a lot of them went to Moldavia, where so many of the refugees have gone from the Ukraine, and they're helping with food and all the things they need. So I was wondering what groups are involved in how much is the United States involved in addressing the phenomenon in the countries I mentioned?
Yeah, so the question has to do with famines that I had mentioned earlier at the beginning of the talk in Ethiopia, Yemen, South Sudan, and of course a looming one in Somalia, and what's sort of being done. It is interesting that there's no Herbert Hoover to the rescue or United States to the rescue. As the Daniel Maxwell article indicates, I think his first name is Daniel. For a while, and Alex Duvall makes a big deal of this, getting aid to Somalia was very difficult for NGOs because of the Patriot Act, because there's Al-Shabaab there, that terrorist organization. And so the United States in the 2011 famine was very, very sort of inhibiting in the sense of Americans coming in to do anything about the famine there. Today, The U.S. very much involved in South Sudan. We helped give birth to this new country back in 2011, and I bet a lot of people who did so regret it ever since. Broke away from Sudan, right? There was a referendum in 2010. It comes into its own in 2011, July. And then within a short period of time, there's violent outbreak. Somebody wins an election, the runner-up contests it. We know about that. But this turns very violent. And these two men happen to be from two different tribes in the country. This led to the point where in my famine course about 3 years ago now, probably 4, we ended with South Sudan because they were talking about massive famine coming to South Sudan. And it's no drought, nothing. It's strictly the breakdown of services having to do with the Civil War. That did not turn out as bad as we thought. The United States is heavily involved there. And the threat of famine in South Sudan, I think, has receded. Yemen, that has to do with Saudi Arabia and, the Houthi rebels, and essentially grows out of that conflict. And I don't know if you read any Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, but boy, a few years ago, he was really angry at the United States government for letting this go on and enabling this. That has kind of faded. I don't know if you remember in 2018, maybe 17, there was a photograph on the cover of the New York Times magazine of a skeletal little girl still alive, just very difficult to look at and very controversial that they published that, right? That's an example of this, as our friend Alex Duvall would say, that's a modern famine. That's purely the result of civil strife. And, we're a lot of us are guilty in this for turning a blind eye. The other one's Ethiopia. That I would pay closer attention to in Somalia. And the reason is the lack of rainfall and the fact that Ethiopia is involved in a kind of civil war, breakaway region of Tigray that you may have heard about. And this violence and the displacement that is causing, it's possible that will erupt and that will come online as a kind of sort of famine we should be concerned about. But the one that keeps almost happening, I mean, I have a whole list of articles from the past year, is Somalia. And there the complications are, the Shabab and the difficulties in that part of the world, but it's mostly the drought right now there. And, 5 years in a row, and here's where the climate change question comes in. How many more years in a row, right? So forgetting where the question was supposed to lead, but I would say that right now the Horn of Africa is where we ought to be looking. I think South Sudan is less about famine and more about the being a failed state in a way. And Yemen, I'm sure it's miserable for the people there, but it's no longer the kind of famine that we saw on the front page of the newspapers back then.
I think we can take one more, either here or.
Zoom land, one more question.
There are no more questions.
Something I said? Okay.
I'll come around. Yeah, I have lots more questions, but we have reached the promised end of the session. Another absolutely fantastic session that if you provide the link for the exhibition, we will disseminate that to everybody on the Great Decisions list. That in passing, Bert made reference to climate migration, climate famine. Next week's topic for the Great Decisions talk is Erica Rose Bauer on climate migration and the way in which that is normally depicted is people fleeing food shortages because of climate change, changes in rainfall. uh, destabilizing the places they go to. So that's a link between tonight's subject and next week's subject. I have great confidence that Erica will do a terrific job, but you've put the bar very high for us tonight. So thanks to everybody who is online. A reminder that the video will be posted in the next few days if you want to go back and review any of this. And if you have questions about the sources that were mentioned, let me know or Lou know, and we'll get them for you. So thank you to everybody. Lou, do you have any closing words?
Only that we have several thank yous from folks on Zoom for a great talk. So thanks for your talk. Very, very informative and entertaining as well in some places. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and end the meeting. So good night, everybody, and thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.